Hello, and welcome to IBM Marketing Cloud's webinar titled Transforming Your Company Through a New Customer Journey Approach. Before we begin today, I wanted to cover a few items. If you'd like to tweet along with us today, please use the hashtag #NewWayToEngage. A copy of today's presentation is available in the resource list widget, and we will also send you a copy later this week. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can click the Q&A widget and submit your question there. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. But if we run out of time, we will follow up with you by email. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget, and we'd be more than happy to assist you or figure out what's going on and assist you in that way. So as of right now, I would like to introduce Michael Trapani, the Product Marketing Manager for IBM Marketing Cloud.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody, and welcome to IBM Marketing Cloud's webinar on customer journeys. So we're going to introduce our feature speaker for today, Rusty Warner. Hey, Rusty.
Hi, Michael.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks everybody else for joining us as well. We're going to take a few minutes first before we get started and dive into the main content to talk a little bit about why we wanted to do this study. First and foremost, as John mentioned, feel free to tweet along with us, ask us questions on Twitter. We'll be responding to those as well, either during or after the presentation. You can also use the hashtag #ThinkMarketing as well, so feel free to use that to reach us. So we're going to start by talking about customer journeys. I think first and foremost, we should define what that is. I think a lot of different organizations have different meanings of customer journeys. It is an emerging concept within the marketing space, so we're going to first define what we mean by customer journeys. The first thing is that while a lot of marketers over time, as we developed more technology for marketing, we became more capable of targeting and sending more types of engagements to customers. So we can send better email, we can reach them on their various mobile channels like push and SMS and even group messaging apps and social. And there's all these great ways to reach customers. But as it turns out, as more of these ways to engage customers emerged, we found that it became more and more difficult to get a full understanding of a customer experience from the campaign level. And so what a customer journey is it allows us to zoom out and get a full picture of the customer's experience with a brand, from when they first hear about your brand, whether it's through a friend or a recommendation or an advertisement that they see on even a billboard or a website, all the way through when they're comparing your brand to maybe a competitor, to when they're learning more about the products or services that you sell, to when they buy it, to when they use it, to when they become advocates of your brand, all the way through. That's what we talk about when we mean customer journeys. And those journeys are usually broken out into different journey stages. So we talked about what some of those might be, right? The compare stage, the learn stage, the buy stage, the advocacy stage. Many organizations have different names for these stages, but what's important is that concept of the full experience and how they're often broken out into stages. So as we learn more about customer journeys and we experience, as a company like IBM Marketing Cloud that works with marketers, we became fascinated with this transition from more of a campaign-focused to a customer-focused, a customer-centric experience. And we wanted to learn more. We wanted to understand more. We wanted to learn how companies and marketing organizations and other organizations within groups are actually using these customer journeys. And so we thought, what better partner to work with for this research than Forrester? Forrester has a great experience in working with marketers and other organizations, so we decided to reach out to Forrester and we commissioned a study on customer journeys. And I think that's a great introduction to pass it off to Rusty, who's going to take it from here and get into the study and the findings itself.
Okay, well, thanks, Michael, and thanks, everyone, for joining the webinar. And Michael just gave you a great definition of what we mean by customer journeys and how those might differ across organizations. But when we started this research project with IBM, we did establish a hypothesis, and there were three different points in the hypothesis. Number one, we wanted to focus on talking to organizations that were interested in delivering a better customer experience. And that typically was expressed as personalizing the customer experience or adapting to customer requirements on a real-time basis and really keeping pace with what customers were expressing in terms of their interactions with the brands. Secondly, we wanted to look at how those experiences are mapped based on insights and data that would be generated by the customers, but analyzed and understood by the organizations that are trying to meet those customers in their moments of need. And then finally, we wanted to look at organizations where there was a collaborative effort in order to be more holistic in the way they approach the customer journey. So not just marketing, but how does marketing work with sales or service or operational teams so that there's consistency in that journey approach, as well as the sustained approach across the customer lifecycle that Michael was referencing as he was explaining our definition. So those were the points that we established, and we then conducted a survey among a lot of different organizations. And the survey involved people from the United States as well as Western Europe. Half of our respondents were from the U.S., and the other half were from the U.K., Germany, and France. And we looked at organizations of very different sizes. So as you can see here in the bar chart, the range of companies involved companies from about 500 employees up, but all of them were above 500, so we did tend toward the enterprise. And as you can see, nearly half of the companies that we talked to were above 5,000 employees, so starting to get quite large. We also looked at a range of different industries. So the largest two industries were financial services, including insurance, as well as retail. But that was closely followed by healthcare, technology companies, consumer goods companies, and also telecommunications and media companies. But we actually had representation from a lot of different industries that you can see represented here. We also looked both at B2C and B2B organizations. So about half of the organizations were either B2C or both B2C and B2B, and then the other half were B2B organizations. So if you're looking at these demographics, and I know we've got a large number of people who are on the webinar today from lots of different companies and different verticals, I think that you will see something on here that is representative of your organization because it was such a broad cross-section of the marketplace in terms of the people that we talked to. And when we started the project, we went to these organizations and we just started with the why. Why do you map and analyze customer journeys? What is your goal when you start this exercise? And the number one reason that people told us that they do map the customer journeys has to do with tactical decision making. It depends on making an offer to the customer or supporting a customer initiative or better understanding how to interact with customers online. But there were also some more strategic reasons, such as understanding how those interactions add up to the ideal customer journey, and how do we analyze that journey so that we can tweak what we're doing with our customers and make improvements so that we can make that experience even better. And of course, if we can do both the tactical and the strategic, it leads to that better understanding of the customer's requirements, and how the brand influences that customer through interactions. And then beyond those top three, there were a number of other reasons why brands told us they did this. Some of them were more long term, such as helping me decide which products I might want to bring to market, or understanding how my customers interact across brands, or perhaps trying to create a new customer engagement strategy. But we found that the top three were really about understanding the customer to improve the interactions and make sure that we were able to address the customer's requirements in that customer's moment of need. I think to sum up why organizations told us they were investing in customer journey mapping is expressed here by one of the customers that we spoke to, who is the head of customer experience at a large telecommunications provider in the United States. And this person told us that the reason that they are mapping the customer journey is that it gives them a rallying cry to align all of the customer-facing teams within the organization so that they can become more customer-focused and really focus on what is required for that improved customer experience. Now, before we go on with sharing more results from our survey, we'd like to hear from all of you. So what you have on the screen right now is a question for you. Assuming that you, members of our audience, are involved in customer journey mapping, or at least you're aware of customer journey mapping exercises at your company, we'd like you to just choose one of the organizations represented here for the team that you see leading the customer journey effort at your organization, whether that's marketing, a CX or customer experience team, a customer services team, something from sales and commerce. Perhaps it's a strategic initiative, it's an operational team, it's coming from IT, or perhaps it is the finance organization. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to select your answers there, and then we'll look and see what all of you have to say about who's leading this effort within your organizations, and then I'll share with you what we found when we conducted our survey. And Mike,
while everyone's
while everyone's choosing, I'll go ahead and bring up what we're seeing here, and it looks like a lot of people, more than half, are saying that the marketing organization leads, although there's people from lots of other organizations who are involved. And I know you are involved in these kinds of efforts with IBM and IBM's customers. So I wanted to turn it back to you to see if this is representative of what you see when you're working with organizations.
Sure, it definitely is. And I think it's what's most interesting about this to me, and I think our survey results were similar, but what interests most about this is that customer journeys and the idea of creating customer experiences actually started as a customer service mechanism. I think that was one of your findings in the larger report as well, this idea that we started the idea of customer journeys as something that customer service representatives used in call centers, because waiting on hold was such a frustrating process, and getting a better idea of where the customer was within their customer journey was developed by call centers to create better experiences for the people who are actually calling in. So I think it's really interesting now, and I think it drives that point home about how big of a trend this is in marketing right now, how popular it has become within marketing, that they have vastly overtaken the interest within the organization of who is leading this experience.
Well, and you're absolutely right, Michael. When we conducted the research and we were talking to these organizations, we found that there were a large number of people who were involved. We saw that marketing led the way in terms of its involvement, but there were, as you pointed out, a lot of people from either the customer experience or the customer services organizations who were involved. And as you pointed out, some of those efforts grew up in the customer service center or the contact center around customer satisfaction surveys and how can we improve our service, and then they grew from there. We also find that IT is involved because as we are beginning to invest more in technology platforms to support these efforts, IT becomes instrumental in helping integrate those platforms and make the data and the insights available to people. And then, of course, it extends to the operational functions, primarily sales, but also the strategic initiatives within an organization, some of the operational functions, and finance as well. Now, in terms of who leads, our survey respondents were completely aligned with what all of you on our audience panel just told us in that impromptu survey. Well over half of the people told us that marketing leads the effort in their companies. We did also talk to some organizations where it was a specialized customer experience team or the initiative had begun in customer services. But in most cases, we found that the marketing organizations were leading the way or had taken ownership of these projects to make them more holistic across the customer journey and not just focused on customer service. Well, we asked these organizations that we spoke to, where do they see most of their efforts applied? And we meant that in the context of the customer journey. And as you can see here, most people, about 2/3, told us that they really focus their efforts around the buy phase, where they are understanding customer intent and trying to drive that transaction or that conversion. So that gets back to some of that tactical decision making that we saw in some of the earlier data that I just showed you. But we found that the journey mapping did apply across the entire customer life cycle. And as Michael pointed out, you might have different terms for these different phases of the customer life cycle. These happen to be the ones that Forrester uses. But we found that when people are discovering the brand and exploring the brand, considering their options, customer journey mapping can be instrumental in understanding how to put the right content in front of the customer across the appropriate channels so that you can answer questions or help them make an informed decision. Then that buy phase, as we see, where most people are focused. But then the customer service and customer experience comes back into play as the customer uses the product and has questions, or perhaps there's a problem that they need to address and they want to ask about that. And then marketing gets engaged again, usually around customer loyalty, customer retention, upsell, cross-sell, and building out the brand advocacy with the different customers. So we find that marketing's involved throughout the customer life cycle, which I think is why marketing leads the effort in a lot of the organizations that we spoke to. But there is, because of that use and ask part of the customer life cycle, lots of opportunity for customer services people and customer experience people to become involved.
I think this is one of the more interesting points within the study because it really illustrates how we are still in early stages of marketers understanding this concept. And I think that doesn't illustrate itself clearer within those last stages, which is this repurchase and brand champions. I mean, you got to figure that since customer advocates are some of your most valuable advertisers of your brand, right? They make recommendations. I mean, marketers will say over and over again that their brand champions are the most important to them. Yet we see that there's such a drop-off, if you will, about engaging those customers and creating customer journeys that incorporate that brand advocacy stages towards the end. So I think it really just goes to show how we're still kind of learning, right? Marketers are still developing this, and we're focusing on the most important sections first. That totally makes sense that we're focusing on those discover and buy and use stages. But we should definitely take a look at this and understand that there are customers towards the advocacy stages that really need our attention as well, and we should be creating experiences that include them as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Michael. And when we were talking to the organizations about that phenomenon. We really wanted to explore with them how they were applying what they do across the customer life cycle and not just to drive a transaction or close a deal. And that became interesting because it's what ultimately uncovered some of the challenges that we see organizations face. And we wanted to understand those difficulties. So we talked a lot about the challenges, and we found that some of them were organizational type challenges, while others were around the technology platforms that they were trying to use. What we found with most of the organizations, the biggest problem was that their skills were not there, or if they did have people who had the appropriate skills for analyzing data and understanding how to apply the insights, those skill sets were siloed across the organization. So some people might sit in marketing while others were in customer experience or customer services, and they just weren't aligned because of those organizational silos. We also found that data access itself was a challenge, just getting the right data so that you could then analyze it. And if you were able to analyze it, were you doing that holistically, or were those data elements siloed because of either technology platforms or because of different channels, whether those were marketing channels or it was the contact center and customer services, or perhaps a face-to-face channel where you had salespeople or service people involved. And then we found that for the organizations who actually had managed to align the data, and they had aligned some of the technologies that they were using to derive insights from the data, there's still both a technology and an organizational lag just in terms of having those insights as readily available as needed so that they can begin to impact decisions with customers in the here and now as those customers are interacting with the brand across those different touch points. And I know, Michael, IBM offers different technologies for marketing, sales, service, and operational people. I wonder if you see some of these challenges in the folks that you talk to as customers.
Sure. Obviously, keeping data in one place or being able to match data across silos, getting that single view of the customer is huge. It's something that we hear about all the time. But I think the larger issue, as you pointed out, is organizational issues where marketing organizations are pretty dated as we know them today, right? I mean, they were marketing and customer engagement as we know it kind of started off decades ago, where we created these very creative focused and design focused, and all of those are very important still, but there has been a dramatic shift towards data driven marketing and understanding how our customers actually behave. So reorganizing our marketing organizations has become a more important point, I think, now, and so we're definitely seeing that as well.
Well, and because we found that all of these are critical areas and they need to be addressed if the organization is going to move forward, we really dug into these a lot more deeply, looking at both the technology issues and the organizational issues. And we'd like to hear from you as to what issues you face. So we have another survey question for you. So the question is, what technology challenges does your organization face? So just think about the technology, not about those organizational elements, and you can tick as many of these as apply to your situation. So the data not being integrated, the tools not being integrated or automated, it takes too long to get the dashboards and create the updates to get the insights. The technology is perhaps too expensive for your organization for the investments. Maybe you don't have the right tools, or the tools are insufficient, or perhaps either because of silos or because of organizational elements, the data quality isn't where it needs to be. So because you're able to tick multiple of those, we'll give you a bit longer on the survey this time, and then we'll look at what you had to say, and then we'll go back and compare that with what we found when we were talking to the organizations in our research project. Great. Well, I'm going to give you a countdown of 3, 2, 1, and we'll click ahead and we'll see what you had to say. And as I suspected here, of course, there were no right answers. All of these would apply, and indeed we see that they do. At least I see that the least response here says that the tools are insufficient. So it looks like people have the tools to capture the data, but there may be issues with data quality or the tools that you use to analyze. There are some issues perhaps with the cost of the technology and the investments that are necessary. And we also see that the data and the tools not being integrated are at the top of the list. And Michael, perhaps you want to comment on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it plays into some of the things that we were looking at earlier, that we were talking about earlier. It's interesting to see that reporting is still a struggle. No matter how good our technology is, it seems like we've become good at making impossible things possible, but not very good at making them easy. So I think there's definitely opportunities for technology companies to do a better job at making data more accessible and making it easier to understand and analyze the data.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it does come down to integration. And what we saw from the audience just now is very similar to what we saw from our survey respondents. They gave us these as their top 3 technology challenges. 1, the data not being integrated. 2, the tools not being integrated. And then likely because of that lack of integration, it simply takes too long to get the insights out of the tools into a report or a dashboard that makes those insights actionable. And in fact, one of our customers that we spoke to, who again is working in a customer experience role at a media company, really underscored that with us. He said there's just so much data to keep up with, and that data is siloed. So trying to integrate that and make sense of it without overwhelming people with all of those different data feeds and data sources is the real challenge when it comes down to it. Now, we didn't ask you as an audience to weigh in on the organizational challenges, but I want to share with you the organizational challenges that people raised in the survey. They told us there were really 5 things that were holding them back. Number 1, it was the skills and just having people that could digest the data, use the analytical tools, and get value out of it. Number 2, it takes too long. So we hear that again. The fact that it took too long and there was this lag because of the data issues also shows up on the organizational side, where because of the way the company is structured or the different functions people have, it just takes too long to get value out of the data so that you know what you need to do to move forward. And then there were 3 that were tied in third place. So a lack of collaboration because of organizational silos, or a lack of a clear strategy because there were in a lot of the cases multiple strategies among different parts of the organization, and then the resources that were trying to leverage the insights were either insufficient or scattered throughout the organization where there just wasn't critical mass. And again, going back to that customer experience expert at the media company, he recognized that these are critical issues that have to be solved because it is an absolute imperative that the organization becomes more agile and is more aligned with the customer expectations. Well, so we talked a lot about challenges. So we are going to give you some advice on what to do about those. And in fact, we're going to give you 3 pieces of advice to begin with. 1, you're going to have to really solve that problem of the diluted resources. If the resources that are able to leverage the analytic tools and get value out of the data are scattered across the organization, you're going to end up with that incomplete view or an inconsistent journey mapping exercise, and likely you'll have different parts of the organization competing in what they think is the right thing to do with the customer. So there will need to be some collaboration and some sharing to bring those resources together and get everyone on the same page. Secondly, we think that because of those resources being scattered across different teams, we don't have enough decisions being based on insight. Our survey indicated that less than half of the decisions out there are being made on data and insights, and the rest come down to experience, or worse, someone's gut feeling, or even worse than that, someone's opinion. And that usually ended up being the HIPPO principle. The highest paid person's opinion would get to make the decision. So if you can get the resources aligned and get them collaborating, we think you can start to make more decisions based on data and insights, and that'll drive the organization in the right direction. And as you do that, you have to think about how people are measured and how you reward and provide incentives for them to participate in the process. So to make your customer focus real, you will need to give these people metrics that are focused on the customer and what you're trying to drive with your customers. Because if their metrics are not aligned and they're not being measured on customer metrics, but it's more an internal type metric that is relevant only to that person's department, you're just not going to be able to accomplish points 1 and 2.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting too, because when we look at things like this, when we look at how technology is playing such an important part, in speaking to a few marketers, and one in particular that I recall a conversation between an e-commerce retailer, and she was saying, as the VP of her marketing organization, that her team, if you looked at it 5 years ago, would be considered analysts, but now they're all performance marketers. So the discipline is changing, and I think that's a really important point, and allowing for the hiring the right skill sets, looking for those skills within marketing employees is really important.
I think you're right. And so now looking at those organizational issues and how to resolve those, we think you also then need to invest in some technology components. And to try to raise that up to a high level, we use 2 classifications at Forrester. We think you need both systems of insight and systems of engagement. So the systems of insight start with customer data. They include the analytics tools that you might apply to the data to derive the insights. And then all of that data-driven effort feeds into the way you create content, the way you set up and configure your marketing automation systems so that they can orchestrate those interactions with the customer. And so systems of insight and systems of engagement give you 2 high-level categories, and you have to balance those so that you are data-driven, but you're able to execute quickly and efficiently and do that across the customer life cycle, as this picture implies. Now, as you're doing that, and as Michael pointed out, you've got to really look at how those tools support the organizational effort, because there is a great deal of data. The volumes keep increasing, so you need to be able to identify the right data so that you can apply the analytics there and make sure that the actions that you're going to take are effective and that they're going to result in the best possible outcome for the customer. There's lots of different paths you can take, and so that collaboration and that team effort within the organization using these tools in a holistic way is what becomes necessary if you want to be the most effective and the most efficient in terms of the experiences that are going to matter to the customer. Now, even though that technology and those systems of insight and systems of engagement that would let you uncover the right data to make sure your actions are the most effective, those technology components are important, But technology is only one part of the operating model, and I can't really stress that enough. As you can see here, we think there's at least 6 different elements of the operating model, and technology is just one of them. The structure and culture of the organization and having the right strategy in place to become more customer focused is absolutely necessary. Then making sure you have the right resources and that they have the right skill sets is a big part of the process. And then those processes and metrics that you put in place for those people to make them most effective at leveraging the technology is what really brings it to life. And so if those are the different elements of the operating model, your guiding principles will be staying customer focused to make sure that the decisions you're making, the investments you're making in technology and people are based on what the customer behavior is telling you, and using the insights from that customer behavior so that you become more agile, more responsive to the customers, and of course, you're connecting the dots across the organization to make sure that you're serving those customers in the best possible way across all of their different touch points.
I think those 4 operating principles really drive home the idea. I mean, even if you think about customer engagement models and engagement platforms, I mean, it seems like every week there's a new channel in which customers are communicating on, right? In 2008, we saw more of an app engagement, but we're seeing, other things now like group messaging and things like WhatsApp and most recently even iMessage and WeChat, and we're seeing so much engagement happening across different channels. In the future, we'll see things like virtual reality and augmented reality and other capabilities through chatbots and things like that. So having that agility is very important too. So it seems to be understanding the customer is really important, obviously, using those insights to understand where the customer is, being fast so that you can react and place and invest in the right technologies as those become available and widely used, and finally connected so that you can share that information and share that performance across the organization.
Well, and for some of the organizations that we felt were working against these kinds of principles, or I should say working in favor of these kind of principles, who were establishing the right organizational structures and were putting technology to use and leveraging it to support their efforts. We wanted to understand what advice do they give, what comes next, where do you go from here if you're starting down this road. And what they came back and told us is you absolutely need a technology strategy. You need someone looking at the investments and ensuring that every piece of technology plugs in and integrates and is a part of the overall process. You then need to make sure that the people are able to use that technology effectively. So you need to bring together the right people and make sure that you've got training programs in place to get that effective use of the technology and leverage it in the best possible way. And that has to be a collaborative effort. It has to be cross-functional. It has to extend to the different parts of the customer journey that we've just talked about so that it is more of that holistic approach. And I think to sum that up, actually, I'll go back to what one of our people in the survey that we interviewed said to us. And this, again, is a customer experience person responsible for the transformation of the customer experience at a mobile operator. And what this person told us is that it comes down to the focus on the customer. And you can see just in the language that this person used how important that customer obsession is to the organization. End-to-end customer journey, focused on the customer goals, making sure that we have customer centricity, making sure that our people who are doing this work have empathy with the customer and are putting that customer front and center to change the culture of the organization to always think of what the customer is telling them and make the most of that to improve the customer experience. Well, we have one more poll question for all of you, because we've talked a lot about the journey. We've talked a lot about the challenges that organizations face when they're trying to map the customer journey. We've talked about some of the technology and organizational changes that might be required. But what do you get out of it? So we'd like all of you to weigh in on what you think the benefits are from doing customer journey mapping and using customer data to analyze what the customers need and be able to anticipate and deliver against those needs. So your choices are revenue, the bottom line, always important, customer retention, growing your number of customers and expanding your base, increasing customer lifetime value, focusing on customer win-back situations, forecasting your customer activity so that you have better operating efficiency, or analyzing and sharing business results so that you have better business reporting within the organization. So some of these are purely revenue and profit focused, some are customer focused, some are more internally focused kind of objectives. You can pick all that apply, and we'll give you a couple of seconds to choose those, and then we'll look at what everyone says collectively. Well, great. I'm going to go ahead and see what you've all had to say. And as I expected, again, because there are no wrong answers here, it's a real mix. We see that revenue is really important, but I'm pleased to see that improving customer retention and also customer lifetime value and that focus on the customer comes ahead of the overall revenue as a general metric here. Obviously, customer retention rates and customer lifetime value are going to drive revenue, but it's really good for me to see that the metrics that had the customer in them are the ones that all of you rated more highly. And in fact, we saw similar results from the survey respondents in general. They did acknowledge revenue as a joint first place answer to this particular question, but they put customer retention rates right there with the same 52%, saying that these were the two most important metrics. They then looked at adding to the customer base and growing the number of customers and increasing the customer lifetime value. So these were the top four for them, very similar to what we saw from all of you. And again, for me, as someone who focuses on how to leverage technology to deliver more contextually relevant customer experiences, it's always good for me to see any metric that has customer in it show up at the top of this kind of list. Well, that brings me to the end of what I have to share with you in terms of what people told us in the survey and getting some of your perspectives as an audience. So thank you very much for your participation. To leave you, I'd just like to give you a bit of advice to summarize here. You know this already. Your customers are empowered, and if you're going to win new customers or serve your existing customers and retain those customers, you have to focus on delivering what's contextually relevant for them and what's useful for them, and you can't just broadcast marketing messages in their general direction. And specifically how that impacts the way you start mapping customer journeys, first, you're going to have to make some investments in technology. So rethink your approach to that technology. Think about systems of insight and systems of engagement. Put the customer need front and center, and then look at the appropriate technologies that are going to let you address that customer need. Secondly, you're going to have to become more analytically driven as an organization. So make sure people realize the value of being data-driven and that it becomes part of everyone's day-to-day efforts as they're thinking about how to better serve the customer. You're going to have to do that in a collaborative way. As we've seen throughout a lot of the survey results from you, as well as from the people that we talked to during this research project, that collaboration from marketing to sales to service across the organization and tying together the customer touch points becomes really critical if you're going to make a difference. And then finally, try to make it more strategic and not just tactical decision making. As we saw in our survey, a lot of people were focused on the conversion and driving the transaction. And yes, that absolutely will help you optimize your revenue stream, but focusing more on that overall customer journey and making your efforts more strategic across the customer life cycle and not just focusing on the purchase phase will really bring this home to the people within the organization and help you transform what you're doing to become more customer centric. So Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rusty. And for those of you that are interested, we are going to be sending this study out to everybody. We'll ask you to stay and ask us questions, but I just wanted to let everybody know that this study is going to be available and you'll receive it via email, but you can also download it right now by going to this URL, and we'll make sure that you get it no matter what. But feel free to download the study. And you'll be able to read a little bit more in depth on this subject. There's a lot more where this came from. Obviously, we can only fit so much within the amount of time that we have. But at this time, we'd like to actually open it up to questions. As we mentioned earlier, feel free to select that Ask a Question button within your webinar tool right now. You can also ask us questions on Twitter. Rusty Warner is at Rusty Warner, or myself, Michael, I'm at That's Logical, or you can use the hashtag ThinkMarketing. So feel free to reach out to us now, and we'll get started with your questions. I'll pass it over to John to moderate those.
All right. So, Michael, the first question is, would you say that most companies have a journey just in certain phases? That's part A. And then part B is, are there any companies doing across all or most phases? If so, are these having any advantages or are there diminishing returns?
That's a really good question. I think the first part we talked a little bit about in one of the findings, which was we did find that a lot of journeys are being focused within the earlier stages to the buy stages and even through the use stage. But we found that it was dropping off a little bit towards the advocacy phases of maybe repurchasing or using that retention towards the post-use phase. We thought that was an interesting piece of information. But I'm actually interested, Rusty, maybe you can tell me if you found anything interesting within, is there a point where developing journey stages, getting too strategic, can have diminishing returns? Is there too much of this investment that you found?
Well, we didn't see that in the organizations that we talked to, and in fact, there's one that comes to mind where becoming strategic was really transformative for them. I talked to an organization, a retailer, who told us how the effort to become more customer driven and to use data and insights to map the customer journey, especially for the e-commerce part of the business, had been an on and off thing because as budgets changed and priorities changed and as management changed, they might find that their funding or their resources just weren't there. But over time, as they were able to show more value for the program and get that strategic buy-in and start to make it more holistic across the customer journey and therefore across the different parts of the organization that touch the customer at those different parts of the journey, it really became a strategic initiative. It got that support it needed from senior management, and they no longer worry about budget setting when the time comes because they know that it's a strategic initiative that's going to get that investment, and they continue to show good results because of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Rusty. So the next question is, should we change the way we organize marketing teams to accommodate customer journey building? Or can we can we proceed with the teams that we have?
Yeah, I think we touched a little bit on this as well, this idea of the customer and the marketing organizations as we know it might feel a little dated in our new, data-driven marketing approach and how we're seeing customers. Marketing is still a very human discipline. It's just now getting more advantages from technology in ways that it previously hadn't done before. I think smaller things like better communication across silos, making sure, obviously, things like marketing speaking to sales and marketing speaking to product and product speaking to customer experience and feedback, making sure that loop is consistent and constantly being rotated. But also even larger changes like creating new roles. We found one organization and a few actually create new roles like experience designer or chief experience officer. This idea of having a more customer-centric role higher up within the organization that can actually, whose sole purpose is to make sure that the customer and get that full picture of the customer experience as a whole, rather than just the specific components of the experience. So little changes like that, I think, can help. Rusty, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, I'll add my agreement, and then I'll add a second point. I think you're right. You go out to play with the team that you have, so you're not going to be able to just on a wholesale basis replace your organization, and I don't think you should. But you can start to make those tweaks that Michael just talked about, and really look at places where it'll make a difference. Look at where you are seeing the most customer interest, the most customer interaction. Look at the people that are responsible for that. Start there, and it'll be an evolutionary exercise, but you can start with the people responsible for the customer activity that's going to make the most difference, and then begin to build on those quick wins. I'd also say that you can start to identify some of the talent within marketing as well as in other parts of the organization, whether they're operational or finance or IT or sales or service. Look at the people who have the skill sets to start helping the organization become more data-driven. Think about perhaps putting those people together as either a center of excellence or a special task force or a project-based team that could start to look at how you can make a difference, how you can get some impact, and give those people a little bit of leeway to execute that project and then bring the results back to the rest of the organization.
Great answer. So another great question came in. Should the focus be on the current state of the customer journey or the to-be state of the customer journey?
That's a great one. I think you probably have to do a little bit of both, right? I think that we should definitely focus, as Rusty said, playing with the team that we have and making sure that we have at least a good understanding of what the customer journey is today, but also having a very, very good understanding that it's may completely change in the future. I mean, I don't think any marketer could have predicted in 2006 that with the launch of modern smartphones, more than half of the web traffic would have shifted to mobile within less than 10 years. So I think it's very interesting that we that these changes occur, and I think we should always be prepared and keep a lookout as technologies emerge. Also, experimenting with new technologies as time goes on. I think that when we look at things like group messaging and things like virtual reality and artificial intelligence, as these technologies are in their early spring stages of adoption, we should experiment a little bit. I mean, test maybe some time around the holidays when you have a little more budget. You can experiment with a small piece of that with some new technology and keep yourself open to those changes. And then making sure that you look into those and make the investments if appropriate.
I would absolutely agree with what Michael said. I think you have to look at what's happening now because you need to understand what's working that you can build on and what's not working so you can fix it, because you are trying to serve those customers in the here and now, but you always have to be looking down the road, especially with the rate of change with technology. Yeah, I'm normally based in the UK, but I'm on the west coast of the US this week, and I love traveling and talking to different organizations. And for example, just yesterday, I was involved in a conversation where Mack Trucks was talking about how they are now selling $175,000 trucks based on leads that arose through social media interactions with potential customers. That's not something I think Mack Trucks would have seen coming a couple of years ago, but you have to be prepared for those kind of technology changes and be able to leverage that technology and take advantage of those opportunities when that's what happens as the customer journey evolves.
Great answer. Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions because they're very similar. So the first part of the question is that you found that the marketing function is the primary driver. I'm wondering if you found what executive roles at the organization were driving or influencing this movement and why, i.e. CMO, CEO, or CIO. Who does marketing need to convince that this is worthwhile? Now, that's the first question, but it also plays into what are some ways to internally sell the strategy across these teams, and how do you get everyone on board?
Well, I think there's a... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Michael. I was going to jump in there because the reason I wanted to jump in is another conversation I had yesterday actually became almost an argument because there was a person who disagreed with me on the fact that marketing should lead, because he thought it really should be a customer service, customer experience effort, and that marketing doesn't own the customer or the customer journey. And we said, absolutely, we don't believe that any one organization owns the customer or owns the customer journey, but we do think marketing should have a leadership role to play, because more than any other part of the organization, marketing can see that entire customer life cycle and how it impacts the way you win and serve and retain the customers. And that's why we think marketing should lead the way. Do they absolutely own it? No, it's a collaborative effort across the organization. So we're not saying marketing should build a fence around it and own it in that sense, but they should definitely lead the way and ensure that there's that collaboration across the organization. And in terms of the first part of that question, leading into the second of who do they work with? It's all of the above. It's all parts of the organization in terms of operations and in terms of IT from a technology integration perspective, and the buy-in from the CEO and the CFO and the other people who need to ensure that the organization lines up behind it. I think we see organizations struggle sometimes with how to prove that value to the C-suite. And I've seen organizations who have done quick wins where they had hard financial metrics, and in some organizations, those are what work and what would be necessary to convince people. But I've also seen some other organizations where they focused on a softer kind of metric where there might not have been a hard figure to show, but it became an emotional kind of decision point, such as getting a new product out to market, or there's a competitor who's just a pain in the backside, and you've done something that really unseats that competitor in the minds of your customers. And those kind of softer metrics that it's harder to put a financial figure on, with some executives, depending on how they're motivated, those might be more effective than the numbers themselves.
Thanks, Rusty. Well, great. Thank you all so much for your time today. Feel free to reach out to us again if you had any other questions that we weren't able to answer. We're going to try to answer them and get back to you via email. But if you have any more burning questions, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter again. Again, that's @RustyWarner and @That'sLogical, or you can tweet at our hashtag #ThinkMarketing.
So thank you to Michael and Rusty, and thank you for everyone joining us today. We hope you all enjoyed the webinar, and also thank you for all the great questions. As we mentioned, as Michael mentioned, we will follow up with each of you by email. If you'd like to see our product in action, we would encourage you to view our 5-minute demo at any time by visiting silverpop.com. Also, on our website in the resources section, there is more information about future webinars, upcoming events, and there's also recordings from previous webinars, as well as a number of white papers and blog entries on a wide variety of digital marketing topics. And again, thank you all again.